Good morning, everyone. Very excited to be with you today to talk about challenges and opportunities in driving operational excellence across the supply chain. So in my work with Bain & Company, I get to work with many of the world's mining companies across a range of different topics. But today it's my privilege to facilitate a conversation, and it is intended to be a conversation, with our panel of esteemed supply chain leaders who each bring a slightly different perspective from different organisations. And I'll ask them each to introduce themselves and share a bit of that background shortly. But first, why are we covering this topic? Well, mining companies are staring into unprecedented volatility, whether that's cost pressure, regionalisation and fragmentation of suppliers, evolving ESG expectations, digital transformation, the list goes on. So in this context, we see the role of supply chain as being really critical to not only driving operational excellence, but also, frankly, maintaining operational continuity. And so Sarah, Nick, Rob, welcome. Before we dive in, I'd love to ask each of you just to introduce yourselves briefly and sort of set the context for the audience around how the role of supply chain is defined in your organisation and what it covers end to end. So maybe Sarah, then Nick, and then Rob.
Sure, thanks, Nathan. I'm Sarah Davies. I'm the Vice President of AngloGold Ashanti in the supply chain operations. I joined the company in January of this year, so I'm quite fresh. 26 years experience in supply chain and procurement, have seen diverse ways of working in healthcare and mining. Organisation operates across 10 operations in Latin America, Africa, Australia, and we look after the from exploration through to closure.
So Nick Stokes, the Regional Director for Supply Chain Operations at Newmont and PNG specifically. I guess I've got a bit of a mixed background in banking, commercial and supply chain. Actually joined Newmont through the Newcrest acquisition. And to give you a bit of an idea as to what supply chain operations encompasses in the Newmont context, it is regional category management. We look after material management, so your inventory, freight, logistics as well as local procurement and business development. So recently, as of 1st of October, the remit did include warehousing, but we're actually in the process now of decentralising warehouse and handing that back to the sites.
Thanks. Rob Jackson, Vice President of Global Commercial and Supply Chain. So I've been in the industry for more than 3 decades now, spanning pretty much every part of the value chain, maybe split roughly 50-50 between ops and what I'll call functions. So South 32, we're a global mining company. We've got operations in Africa, Australia, the Americas, so quite diverse geographically and also commodity-wise. Our operations span the aluminium value chain from end to end. We've got operations in the manganese industry. We've got silver, lead, zinc operations, nickel operations, and also some big projects that we're building at the moment. So what's in my remit? I think similar to what was just described, pretty much everything to do with the buying of stuff for South 32, so all of your sort of traditional purchasing, local procurement, category. We've also got all of the warehousing activities on sites, a lot of the logistics activities, and we also have accountability for the carbon desk, energy, and interestingly, all of our facilities management across the globe as well. So it's quite a diverse role and one that I enjoy very much.
Thanks. I think that sets the scene perfectly for the different sort of vantage points and perspectives that you each bring, but also the discussion that we'd like to have today. So moving into the first topic, I wanted to talk a little bit about volatility in the mining sector and the role supply chain plays in that. So volatility certainly isn't new for the mining sector, but it does seem to have become the new normal, particularly in the last half decade or so. Rising input costs, supply chain, shipping disruptions, unpredictable geopolitics. And so I think in this context, we can't necessarily plan for the unplannable, but how do we build the ability to respond to the unexpected and build resilience and adaptability into our supply chains? And so Nick, I'd love to start with you on this. I'm sure you have to deal with the odd curveball here and there in your role supporting a very remote operation in PNG. So how have you thought about building that ability to respond to unexpected events, whether that's capability of the team, whether that's processes, systems, even a mindset. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about that, and we can open up to Rob and Sarah afterwards.
Thanks, Nathan. I think, look, it's fair to say the volatility will remain ongoing. I think we're not going to see that change anytime soon. You know, in terms of how we approach it at Newmont, I think the focus on the fundamentals remains, you know, the key focus, being, you know, quite disciplined in around strong cost and capital discipline, including, you know, if you think about our inbound and outbound supply chain as well, in terms of how we actually partner with site to make sure that we're really understanding of what we need and also giving those signals to the market at the right time and making sure that we remain lean and mean. And I guess there's really two reasons for that. I think, look, it's fair to say the gold price is fantastic, but we can't rest on our laurels. So the fact that you know, we need to be competitive ongoing is one thing, and we can reward our shareholders and investors along the way. And then secondly, most importantly as well, we also build that resilience, right? So if and when there are changes in commodity prices, we are actually able to respond to them in a measured way, or we already have that resilience to withstand those pressures that we potentially will face in the future. Outside of that, I think we do need to think a little bit differently about how we approach the market, contracts, collaboration. You know, you said, you know, we can't plan for the unplannable. I do actually actively encourage my team to think about the unthinkable. And what that actually looks like in practice is, you know, I'll give you one example. In our planning session early in the year, I used AI. I'm a bit of a novice in that regard, but dummied up a newspaper article that said, you know, the PNG government has just announced that tomorrow 100% of all materials and services need to be procured in country. And essentially the ask of the team was, what are we going to do? So look, in reality, a low probability but high impact type change, right? But really inspired some good thinking and some different thinking, actively encouraging people to think differently about what biases they might have or how they might need to, you know, pivot and change the way they engage or think strategically about, you know, how they develop opportunities where otherwise we might not have had that push on us to go a different way. And I think as an organisation as well, it's quite key that we think about this in terms of not just downside risk. You know, it's risk and opportunity. So as organisations, we need to be super clear on what is our risk appetite. You know, what sort of signals are we tracking in the market, and how does that, you know, lend itself to then taking opportunities at the right time? And you know, simultaneously, it's about building that capability in the organisation. It's not just knowing about the risk appetite; it's actually knowing how do we react as an organisation in an agile and effective way.
And Rob, you've seen the supply chain from both sides, so to speak, as an ex-operations and now working directly in the supply chain organisation. How do you see the importance of supply chain supporting operations through these unexpected events? Have you seen the way that supply chain collaborates with operations evolve at all in your time? Can you talk a little bit about how supply chains and operations might work together to collectively respond?
Yeah, so I think I've seen both of those. So, you know, collaboration and working with the ops. Probably the few things I'd say firstly is, you know, as a leader in the supply chain, you've got to know your customers well. So know the ops, know what they want, know what they need. And that's a little bit more than just sort of the cursory, you know, conversations, interactions. You've got to have a really good understanding of, well, what's critical for this operation and what happens if we can't get it. So you've got to know your vendors, obviously. We talk about that a lot, typically as supply professionals, but I think equally you've got to have that understanding of what your customers want. And then, you know, frankly, you've got to be up the front in the cockpit of the plane while it's being flown. You're not a service function that sort of sits up the back. You've got to take a very active role in ensuring that the operations get what they need when they need it at the best, you know, risk profile possible. And yeah, one thing I'd add, and you know, about planning for the unknown, I think it's important that you also acknowledge that you're not going to be able to understand all of the unknowns. So yeah, there's a certain amount of rigor that you've got to do, understand those critical inputs, where they come from, what the risks, how you're positioned if things go a little bit sideways, but then maintain a level of capability and capacity to move quickly when stuff happens. And we've got some really good examples in our business, I'm sure everyone does, but you often think about the pandemic. A lot happened during that period that I don't think anyone could have foreseen, to be honest. And what I admired in our teams was their resilience. So people tended not to get flustered. They just got on with finding solutions. And some of them weren't small. Like we run an operation in Colombia, requires oxygen as an input to produce the final product, which is a nickel product. And the government made a decision that all oxygen needed to be diverted to hospitals for medical reasons and for good reason. And so in very short order, and I'm talking days, if not weeks, it definitely wasn't months, we had to completely turn that supply chain on its head. And we managed to import a whole bunch of oxygen from other countries, and that was something that I could never have imagined. We certainly, we'd had contingency planning for the supply of that, but not to that extent. And just watching the capability of the team, because they had good professionals who were motivated, committed, and able to come up with good solutions that kept the operation sort of producing through that period. So that's the other element I would add.
I think what comes through there is really the importance of collaboration and engagement. I think supply chain organisations in years gone by have been perceived as a bit of a back office or transactional function at times. But increasingly we are seeing supply chain teams play a much more integrated and strategic role. And so Sarah, maybe if we could move on to you. I'd love to hear from you a little bit about how you've seen the role of supply chain evolve in your current organisation, but also in your past years of experience. What's helped drive that collaboration, for example, with operations, technical functions, support functions, as well as external parties as well? Love to hear you talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think the biggest shift that I've seen throughout my career in the various organisations, and one we're trying to bring into Anglo, is just that procurement is more than just a transactional function. It is actually a service partner. And to enable that, we've got to build trust with the technical teams and with the operational team. So I really encourage my team to get out into the field, understand what's going on, understand, and influence those planning processes, which ultimately can help benefit the supply chain processes and strategic sourcing. So I think often stakeholder engagement relationships build that trust. It can be disjointed, and you have to be intentional with your effort, not make assumptions, but really prove through results, open dialogue about the value that supply chain can bring. And I think the beautiful thing about supply chain is it's not about the lowest cost, right? We spend a lot of time challenging. It's about value. It can drive economic, social, license to operate factors. So it's really broad, and it's more than just pushing a PO. So I still think there's traditional mindsets that are in play, and I just think to transform, we just have to keep on educating, show our results, but just be open to navigate on the journey together.
Yeah, thank you. And Nick, you talked a little bit in your introduction around how the role of supply chain is evolving a little bit even now within your role. How do you think about the role that supply chain can play, in the operational region of PNG? What's the rationale behind how you're making decisions to change sort of the accountabilities and how you integrate with the operations? Is there any sort of philosophies behind that you'd unpack?
No, it's probably just building on the example that you raised. It's no longer a back office function, right? It's not a means to an end or a toll gate to get through just to get to an outcome that might be preconceived. So I think, it's really on us as a service provider to be, super accountable. We are a cost, and as part of that cost, we actually need to be able to demonstrate that we are delivering value for the operations, and they're the actual, the parts of the business that are generating the revenue for the company and our shareholders. So, we are super, deliberate about the structure that we deploy. It's making sure that we do have presence on site and a seat at the table as well on those site leadership teams to make sure that we are across the priorities and actually thinking about how we're adding value and not just in terms of delivering an arbitrary savings target. And also, I think it acknowledges the fact that the role of supply chain is increasingly more complex these days. And if you think about, the rate of innovation and disruption, ESG as well, all these things, they're not, necessarily mutually, well, they aren't, right? They're not mutually exclusive things, and they also do have an impact on the commercial, the economics of a mining organisation. So, we have to be quite disciplined and focused about how we partner. And I think, more times we can actually, demonstrate to the organisation, and even to others external to the organisation, that we can deliver a lot of value just through partnering to remove waste, inefficiency. It's not just about going to the market looking for a silver bullet to deliver that cost or favourable outcome.
Yeah, I'm really glad you raised the sort of notion of earning a seat at the table and building that trust and credibility. Rob, maybe I could hear from you a little bit on that. Obviously, as an ex-GM and supply chain leader, you talked earlier about some of these moments of truth that you experienced during the pandemic, and I imagine that goes a long way to actually establishing that relationship. What sort of mindset and engagement do you think is required for supply chain organisations to really integrate with operations?
Yeah, I mean, I look at, I guess, the answer to this question quite simply. Like, it's easy to go to some of the more fundamental things that supply chain does around systems, processes, capability, and we've got to keep building on those, there's no doubt about that. But you just used the word mindset, and I see that as probably one of the key shifts that at least we're making, which is around shifting the team's mindset away from being a service provider. I mean, obviously we're still doing stuff, but it's about having that seat in the cockpit with the operations flying the aircraft. And it's a very different mindset, and moving away from, and I'm glad to hear what you just said now, Nick, around that value piece, because yeah, we're a cost centre, but we also create value. And so we measure our worth less in terms of our FTE and what it costs to run the team, and more in terms of, well, what value are we actually bringing back to the organisation. And we do all the standard benchmarking and stuff like that, but that helps people get that sense of purpose, and it makes their sort of mission very clear. We're part of the ops teams, we've got a seat at the table, earn it and hold it. And one of the things we're sort of focusing on at the moment is really part of that mindset shift is, how do we become more comfortable with being challenged and challenging? And that's probably the biggest shift for us. Often, you see a lot of these functions that maybe don't feel like they've got the same level of authority and credibility as some of our operational brothers and sisters. But if you take that and start having those courageous conversations, you often, if not always, get to a very different and better outcome. So that's part of the mindset shift that I see playing out at the moment, and it's delivering some really good results for us.
Excellent. And maybe staying with you, Rob, for a moment, and Sarah raised this point earlier, every sourcing decision we make involves some form of balanced trade-off, and I think it's clear it's rarely these days just as simple as solving for cost and cost alone. There's a balance across license to operate, ESG outcomes, total cost of ownership outcomes, supplier stability, and I'm sure there's more. And so in this sort of context, is there anything you'd share about how you navigate those decisions and those trade-offs, whether it's a principle or a framework or, again, a mindset? How do you think about getting to the right decision across those many different criteria that we're always solving for in supply chain?
Yeah, I think, like my colleagues here, having operations in quite a diverse geographic lay of the land, you have to be quite cognizant of some of the local nuances. So I'd say that first, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Then the simple thing I'd say is we look through the lens of risk. So for me, it's all about risk and understanding your process, and when you bring risks into the process and you design for them. So we have a process that's actually not particularly complicated. It's probably very similar to what others do, but it's about understanding, well, what is it that we need? What are the risks associated with it? How are we going to position for that as we go to the market? How are we going to assess people, and how are we going to pick the partner that we want to work with? So there's some really hard sort of ticket to the game kind of things that we have, and they'll be around things like your typical ESG stuff, modern slavery, anti-money laundering, sanctioned parties, all of those kinds of things. So if you can't tick the boxes there, you don't even pass go. And then we start to introduce, probably some of your more typical ways of assessing, or risk criteria maybe is what I'll call them. And what I find interesting is most of them hold across all of our business. It doesn't matter if you're running an operation in the Kalahari in South Africa or a project in Arizona, they're consistent across our group. And then we introduce the local requirements. So for example, in South Africa, we've got some very sort of strict requirements around what we do with black economic empowered entities. As an example, Australia, it's RAP, local procurement otherwise. We find it's quite important to try and remove biases from the decision making. And I'd be really interested in people's views on when you start, if you're sitting in an operation, let's say it's an aluminium smelter, and you buy this thing that's really important, and if you get it wrong, it's really bad. There's an inclination to keep buying that thing from the same supplier over and over and again, even if there's a very strong economic argument to do otherwise. So we've tried to structure our process around understanding the risks, and this is why we tend to bring it in early in a way that overcomes those biases. And it's been quite fascinating. We've started to shift the mindset of some of our operational brothers and sisters now. So we're now getting a pull from them to do this rather than us continuing to push it on them. And the fundamentals of it, when you boil it all down, we just use like a standard sort of Crypto-Trigo style assessment methodology where we have our different buckets of risk categories, and we get levels of segregation where we need to, if we need to, and we go through a process that's quite robust and spits out an answer on the other side.
It's really, really interesting. And Nick, perhaps I could hear from you a little bit on that, the notion of the local nuance on different sort of elements of the supply chain activities and the different categories that you're sourcing. Sort of Rob talked about, you do have a framework, but then you need to layer in some of the local nuance to ensure you're adding value for all of the stakeholders. Is that something you give a lot of thought to operating in Papua New Guinea, and how do you go about doing that?
Yeah, it's actually quite a strong feature of supply chain in PNG. It looks very different to what it looks like in other supply chain teams across the globe. So we do have a dedicated lead for local procurement and business development, and they also are supported by a team who are responsible for executing the more tactical local procurement opportunities, but also they play a huge business partnering role in working with the rest of the organisation, whether that be through the global category management team or the regional category management team, to look at how we're driving a local procurement and business development agenda through those strategies and contracting strategies. Similarly, it's a huge part of the role in how we engage with government as well. We can't do it alone. We actively engage with government and government departments to think about how we can actually move the needle, not just for our business, but also in PNG to deal with other more systemic issues around capability deficiencies, labour shortages exist in PNG as well as other regions. How do we build a more competitive domestic manufacturing industry in PNG that really doesn't exist today? And also, how do we facilitate more strategic business opportunities for companies besides the more tactical office supplies or cleaning services? Really actually driving some meaningful change there that will also then benefit the local communities, the circular economy within PNG. And similarly, looking at how you develop industry as well to be more competitive, not just nationally, but also internationally. So, the role that we can play is also, facilitating that change, helping to mature or even create those downstream supply chains that will also then benefit PNG and its economy.
Yep. And Sarah, perhaps if I could bring you in here as well. You operate in a very diverse set of regions as well, from Australia to North America, Latin America, and Africa, which is in and of itself made up of many different regions. So how do you think about the different sort of nuanced approach that you need to take to managing the supply chain operations in each of the regions in your portfolio? Is it more local and regionalised, or is it more global, or is it somewhere in between?
I think it's somewhere in between. I think really you've got to understand your local jurisdiction and what where you're going, partner with your ESG, because I think we've moved beyond, cost and technical outcomes in the last 10 years. I've seen that shift, safety considerations, and then also that genuine need to develop and upskill local businesses and people. And I think we have we can play a huge part in that from supply chain's perspective. But I think it depends on what's going in your country or region. Like the Africa, there's 4 countries that we have to operate, and they're very, very different. We may have some restrictions put on by the government that we have to just work with. I also think, the pandemic really opened that up in terms of having a diverse supplier base, knowing what you need to do, and that coupled with that balance of ESG as well. And it could also impact some of your license to operate. So it's quite complicated. It's evolved per se from maybe where it was in the traditional, 5-10 years ago. I still think we've got more to do in this space, but I think the first thing is just understanding the countries in which you're operating and the headwinds that are coming, and prepare for what good could look like in that space.
Yep, absolutely. And maybe staying with you, Sarah, I'll let you have a drink of water, but staying with you for a moment. So we started with the macro, volatility. We've now gotten into some of the more micro, country by country considerations and creating value for stakeholders. I'd like to also think a bit more about the future and what that looks like, and create a bit of space for some messages from each of you actually about what is it that you think is most important for supply chain organisations to be thinking about in the way they support operations and mining companies, both today but then also in the future? Are there any new technologies that might be game changers or not? Are there any sort of upcoming challenges that you see coming around the corner that we should be preparing for? Or is there anything, frankly, that you're excited about that could drive the next wave of improvement for your supply chain organisation? Maybe Sarah, we'll start with you, and then we can move through Nick and Rob.
I think the most important thing is to understand your company and where it is today. We're all in very different states. You may have someone that's a leader or someone that's a fast follower. So I think it's just being really clear where you are. Understand what's going on, know where you want to go in a year, 3 years, 5 years, and just think about your people who are one of your most critical assets. Invest in them, upskill, take them on the journey, and that includes your end users. I think you've just got to have that clear path and vision and communicate that down. Be resilient, and just know where you are and where you want to go, and hold strong. Would be my kind of takeaway, and focus on what you can control. There is so many things going on. You could wake up, something else has happened in the next 24 hours. So something I really encourage my team, what can you control and influence, and just focus on that, but give them the vision of where we're heading, and be committed and dedicated to the development of the people.
Yeah, really interesting to hear the development of the people being so sort of at the forefront of all of that. Nick, anything you'd add on what's coming up?
I'd agree. I think what Sarah said was really, really true, and the fact is our people remain our critical assets. We need to keep investing in our people and building capability there. In saying that, we can't deny or we need to acknowledge the pervasive influence of AI and Gen AI on the industry, and the rapid change of the industry as a result of technology and innovation. And I think for me, it's around how do we learn to work with it. So build the ecosystem, the culture to embrace it. I don't see it as a silver bullet, and I think now more than ever we talk about the role of partnering being so critical, ongoing. The reliance on people and the skills to help develop and execute the right strategies for the organisation, or be resilient and agile to deal with the headwinds and opportunities that come up day to day, week to week. So I think we can't ignore that the human factor is incredibly important ongoing. I don't see that changing anytime soon. And look, that's not just my personal opinion. But we can't ignore the fact that, as I said, this pervasive influence of AI in the industry and also on society. So, I've had personal experience where, team members, they see other team members using it to draft emails, and they question that. And, they label it as being lazy. And I think we need to change that dynamic and really think about, okay, let's not over-rely or put too much trust in some of these systems. I think we still need to sort of QA, QC these outputs or outcomes. But using it as an enabler, like if it's going to deliver us or get us to an outcome sooner, should we reward that as opposed to, recognising 40 hours of effort or, a month to get to an outcome as being the success of an outcome? If we can get there in 1 day or 1 week, surely that's got to be better for the organisation. So I think part of that is how we embrace it and tackle the culture, and also how we use it as an enabler rather than as a silver bullet. And I think the best piece of advice that was given to me was think of it as an intern, a highly intelligent, ambitious and motivated tool that probably doesn't have the real world experience yet. So how do you bring that into your ecosystem and sort of build it out around that and also use it to the advantage of the rest of the talent that you have in that ecosystem.
Yeah, I just want to add there, because you think about the emerging workforces coming in as well, right? We've got very different skill sets of the last, say, 30 years. So I think that's something we've all got to plan for as well. We're in a very diverse workforce mix right now, which will change in time, right?
Yeah.
They'll be demanding AI.
Yeah, and I think when done well, as you described, Nick, we do see AI and generative AI working as a force multiplier for teams. And I'd actually love to just unpack that a little bit further. That's quite different. It's a different skill to the skills that we will have taught supply chain practitioners 5-10 years ago. And so is there anything you'd share on how you think supply chain operators can prepare themselves a little bit for that? Is there any sort of training and development, experimentation that you've been thinking about that you'd suggest?
Yeah, it's taken various shapes and sizes. We've done some pretty novel exercises around, getting the team together and using it to write a resignation letter, and get them to sort of play around with different tones, etc. And then to actually looking at how we actually use it to build more credible data integrity as well within our material management and inventory systems. So looking at how we can actually build a better outcome that we can use as supply chain, but also will hugely benefit our main customer in the asset maintenance space.
Rob, is there anything you'd add about what's coming up around the corner, whether that's a challenge or an opportunity that you're staring into at the moment or that you see coming up over the next 5 to 10 years?
I'd probably say, to me, challenges are opportunities. That's not an or, it's an and. For me, themes that we're just going to have to get used to: volatility, requirement for high productivity and good decision making. So the volatility piece, we talked about that earlier, being ready for the stuff that you can't see coming. And as I said, getting close to the businesses, know them well, know your customers. On the sort of systems and process piece, one, and this sort of plays to productivity and good decision making, and I'll touch on technology as well, is how do you simplify them as much as possible? And I often look at our systems and processes, and there's stuff in there that's there for good reason, but does it actually add that much value? And they chews up time and energy. So how do we start ripping that stuff out or replacing it with technology? And I think simplification is a bit of a sort of undervalued word. And we're seeing great benefits from that in our business now. Like, if we can simplify, you can't always simplify, because simplification doesn't always equal better, but sometimes it does. So it's really challenging yourself around your process and systems. Where can you simplify so you get effective systems that lead you to good productivity and better decision making? AI is sort of a real sort of buzzword. Everyone's talking about it, and for good reason. I'm optimistic about AI. I think absolutely it's going to help us as an enabler to better productivity and decision making. I think it's easy to get distracted by it. And so you've got to be really disciplined in your approach to assessing AI opportunities. And I like the sort of experimentation piece, and that's where we're seeing good value, is sort of encouraging and almost modelling, trying AI tools and opportunities. And buying off-the-shelf stuff. We're a bit cautious about going out and developing bespoke. We have done it, by the way, and some of them will work really well, but we're cautious about it because, again, I think you can get distracted by a lot of these things that people are trying to convince you are good ideas, whereas the off-the-shelf products we're learning is typically a very good way to sort of bring those kinds of tools into your processes to simplify and or reduce human requirements, give you better productivity decision-making.
Really interesting. And actually, just final point on future-facing topics. You've all described a little bit of what's coming up. I'll have to ask just a pointed question on data and AI to each of you. In the next 5 to 10 years, do you see AI complete game changer or bit-by-bit improvement? Maybe, Rob, we can start with you and then back through Nick and Sarah.
I'm conscious of time. I think complete game changer is a relative thing. So compared to today, we'll probably go, wow, that was a game changer. But at that point in time in the future, I think we'll just feel like it was incremental. I think it's just going to slowly creep into our lives. It'll be like the frog in the saucepan. We'll hardly notice it, but it is going to drive us to a better place.
Nick?
Look, I tend to agree with Rob as well. I think we'll probably see a more radical change as well. I think about my own children. They're 11 and 9, and they're learning about how to use and deploy AI in the classroom and for learning purposes. So I think we'll see this radical change as more and more digital nomads come out of school into the workplace. The rate of adoption and the rate of change will probably be more pronounced, but I think it is relative, right, in terms of where we are today and the rate of change over time. Yeah.
Yeah. Sarah?
I think AngloGold are in a different space at the minute, and I think for us it's supply chain will be able to leverage. We need to closely partner with our digital technology function to really influence and get them to support. I'd say we're not as far advanced in that organisational transformation yet, but certainly on that road.
Interesting. So, Sarah, Nick, Rob, fascinating conversation. We could have kept going, I think, for hours, but sadly our time is up. So just to underline a few of the main points that I had written down just in closing, I think number one, volatility is the new normal. And so building that adaptability and resilience into the supply chain, but also I think thinking through the scenarios, what is the worst case? And understanding the criticality of the assets and the goods and services that you're buying for sites and how to prioritise. I think number two, it's clear that supply chain is no longer a back office function. Increasingly an integrated and strategic partnership role, but it does take time to build that credibility and relationship with end users. Number three, I think there is an opportunity from simplification and latest tools, an opportunity to force multiply through use of data and AI. And then I think the fourth point that came through for me is that the work of supply chain is really about creating value for all stakeholders. So shareholders, local communities, end users. It is broader than just solving for cost. It's about value for everyone. So I took so much away from this discussion myself. I'm sure our audience did too. So thank you, Sarah, Nick and Rob, for expanding on that for us all. And I look forward to continuing the conversation. Enjoy the rest of IMARC.